Good morning and welcome back to our Ask the Agronomist Facebook Live. We are here today just outside of our headquarters in our plots over by Alexander, and we are here to talk about soybean aphids and corn aphids.
Yeah, a beautiful morning to talk about a pest that we don't like to see coming in this time of the year, but this is the time that it typically starts showing up.
Yeah, let's just talk about first the infestation. So what have you been seeing out there?
Sure, so I've mainly been hearing reports of guys seeing it coming into their soybean fields and corn fields. I know I've been seeing some of that too on Twitter as well, and reports from my own wife not that far away in their corn fields. Really heavy infestations, which isn't necessarily typical. We do see it occasionally, but so northern Iowa, I would say, is getting some of that migration. You know, they move off those buckthorn plants around this time. After they've grown up a little bit, they start producing winged aphids, and then they start to move and migrate into that secondary crop, which is typically, you know, soybeans. So starting to see some of those infestations, and some people are reporting outside edges of the field. Some are saying they're everywhere. So we know they're coming.
Okay, sounds good. So as far as decision making, let's start talking about the threshold, identification, when to make the move.
So the thing about aphids, it's very interesting. One of the things I really enjoyed learning about in entomology, you know, if you're a little bit of a nerd when it comes to insects, but aphids have a really fascinating way of reproducing. They're not a very strong insect, but when they get into the secondary crop, the soybean crop, they're doing an asexual reproduction. So those females are essentially giving live birth to live aphids that are all females. So they reproduce very quickly.
Right.
Every 6 to 7 days they can double in population.
Okay.
That's why you see just masses of them when they come in, and they typically, so the way they feed, they have piercing, sucking mouth parts, is what they're called, and they pierce into the leaf and they suck right out of the phloem, or the food cells and the food tissue in the plant, which is why their damage can be so bad. But they'll start on we'll say the best leaves, you know, the top leaves, the most fresh leaves that they like to go after first. So that's typically where you'll see them, at the top of the plant, at the top of the canopy, and then they'll work their way down. If you're seeing them further down on the plant, you know that there's heavy.
They've been there for a little bit.
They've been there for a little while. And then another good indication, like I said earlier, is if they have wings. If they have wings, that means that they feel crowded, and they need to spread it out. So they start giving birth to winged aphids. But so the threshold that most of us are, you know, somewhat familiar with is 250. That's the magic number, and that's for spraying. You know, and the reason for that is the actual injury, the economic injury level threshold, is more like 675.
Okay.
So about 700 aphids per plant, which is a lot. I know most people don't want to count that, but so 250, you can kind of get a good idea pretty quickly how much that looks like on a plant, and that 250 threshold gives you the time to make that call. Once you see 250, by the time you get a sprayer out there in the next day or two, you know, we talked about how fast they double in population. It's probably going to be close to that 675 number.
Okay.
So that's the one you need to look out for, and you need to, you know, be on guard. The other thing I'd say with thresholds is, you know, pay attention to where they're at in the field.
Yeah.
You know, they may just be on an edge of the field. You know, so don't get carried away if you see 1 or 2 plants that are just covered in them. Obviously, that's going to affect those couple plants, but you want to make sure that you're making the call to spray an insecticide, you know, based on a large area. You know, we want to see at least 70 to 80% of those plants, you know, having some aphids on them, you know, and being close to that threshold before you're making that call to spray, because if you don't, you may miss that. You know,
so what about the growth stage of the plant? When is it too late, or when has the plant gone
too far? That's a good thing to point out. You know, right now, you know, it may be kind of hard to see this plant. We're behind in terms of when we planted. But if you look at this plant, it's actually just pretty much at R3, I would call it. So you see this smaller pod here showing up on the 4th node down. So it's about at R3. Some guys may be a little more advanced than that, R4. Once you're getting about R6, which is that green bean stage, or I call it kind of edamame stage, you know, where they're filling the pod. At that point, if you're seeing infestations, it's not typically going to pay to treat because they're not doing enough damage to you know, the photosynthetic part of the
Right.
plant to be warranting a spray.
Makes complete sense.
Yeah. So.
All right, and then what about corn? Any thresholds that you'd like to mention for corn, or where does that decision making come
there's
in?
there's not a perfect threshold for corn. I've heard numbers like 500 per plant. You know, corn's a much bigger plant, obviously, but you need to pay attention to where it's at on the plant too. Are they congregating around the ear and the ear leaf? You know, if they are covering that ear leaf and it's just covered in aphids and honeydew, you know, obviously that honeydew that they secrete and leave behind affects that leaf's ability to do photosynthesis. You know, it's a mess, and anybody that's seen it knows that. So, you know, that should be a factor. If you're seeing, you know, 75-80% of the plants around you that are covered in honeydew, it's probably warranting, getting close to warranting a spray. So that's what I would say with that. There's not a perfect threshold on corn, but you know, if you go out there and you see how ugly it looks, you know, then you're probably gonna, you know, go ahead and make the call. So.
Okay, sounds good. Well, anything else that you'd like to touch on this morning?
No, the only thing else I'd say when it comes to spraying an insecticide, and I don't tend to encourage people to just, you know, go out and spray, but for soybeans in particular, you know, if you haven't, you know, sprayed a fungicide or something on, you may want to consider that. Look at the, you know, in this case, I'm not seeing much disease, but around this R3 time period is a great time to spray fungicide, because typically that's when you start seeing more infestations of diseases like brown spot or something, you know. But pay attention if you have, you know, diseases coming in on the top or the bottom of the plant. It might be worthwhile to consider putting a fungicide in there, because there tends to be a synergistic effect between spraying the two. So R3 is an excellent time to put a fungicide on beans as well. So just something to think about if you're going out there and going to spray for aphids anyway. Maybe look at the rest of the canopy, take some good notes, and see what the disease looks like right now.
Okay, sounds good. Well, thank you for joining us this morning.
You're welcome.
And thank you to our listeners for tuning in. Have a good day.